I'm Captain Amelia Stewart, 32 years old, a former Air Force intelligence officer and Bronze Star recipient who spent most of her 20s coordinating rescue missions in places most people only hear about on the news. For years, I fought through panic attacks, sleepless nights, and a world that didn't believe what invisible wounds could do. But when a man on a flight laughed at my service dog, mocked the PTSD that nearly killed me, I made a choice that changed everything. Have you ever been belittled or dismissed by someone who had no idea what you've survived? If so, tell me your story in the comments. You're not alone. Before I get into what happened on that plane, let me know where you're watching from. And if you've ever had to stand up for yourself after being written off or humiliated, hit that like button and subscribe for more true stories about strength, service, and reclaiming your worth. What happened next might surprise you. I sat in 22C with Ranger pressed against my legs, his warm weight the only thing keeping my breathing steady. The cabin smelled like recycled air and overpriced coffee, and I could feel eyes on us before we even settled in. It always happened this way. The vest on Ranger's back read "Service Dog, Do Not Pet" in bright yellow letters, but that never stopped the stares, the whispers, the sideways glances that said what people were too polite to say out loud. You don't look sick enough to need that. I tucked my bag under the seat and ran my fingers through Ranger's golden fur, feeling his heartbeat slow mine down like it always did. He'd been doing this for 3 years now, ever since the VA matched us through their service dog program. Before him, I couldn't even drive to the grocery store without my hands shaking on the wheel. Now I was on a plane to San Diego for my brother's wedding, and I was going to make it through this flight without falling apart in a bathroom stall. The man in 22B arrived last, wheeling an expensive carry-on and wearing a suit that probably cost more than my monthly disability check. He was maybe late 40s, with the kind of salt and pepper hair that men pay good money to maintain, and the confident walk of someone who'd never been told no in his life. He glanced at Ranger, then at me, and something flickered across his face. Not quite disgust. Something closer to amusement. "Excuse me," he said, his tone polite enough that a stranger might have missed the edge underneath. He gestured to the middle seat between us. I pulled Ranger closer to give him room. The man settled in, arranged his things with precise movements, and pulled out his phone. For a moment I thought maybe I'd imagined it, that look. Maybe I was being paranoid. 3 tours and a medical discharge did that to you, made you see threats where there weren't any. Then he glanced at Ranger again and smiled. Not a friendly smile. "Another one of those emotional support mascots," he said, just loud enough for me to hear. "Must be nice, getting to bring your pet everywhere." I kept my eyes forward, watching the flight attendants demonstrate oxygen masks for the 100th time in my life. Ranger shifted, sensing the change in my pulse before I even felt it myself. His training was impeccable. He'd been taught to recognize the signs: elevated heart rate, shallow breathing, the slight tremor that started in my hands and worked its way up my arms. "He's a service dog," I said quietly. "Certified through the VA." "Sure he is." The man's voice carried that same half-joking tone, the kind that let him deny he meant anything by it if I pushed back. "Everyone's got PTSD these days. Must be nice to get special treatment." I didn't answer. There was nothing to say that he'd hear. I'd been through this before at restaurants, at the mall, once at a movie theater when a manager asked to see Ranger's papers even though the law said I didn't have to show them. People like this man, they didn't want to understand. They wanted to feel superior, to look at someone like me and think, at least I'm not that weak. The plane started taxiing, and I focused on the rhythm of it, the way the engines hummed beneath us. Ranger put his head on my knee, and I rested my hand on his neck, feeling his pulse against my palm. In through the nose, out through the mouth. The therapist at the VA had made me practice this breathing for 6 months before she'd even submit my name for the service dog program. "You have to be able to help yourself before a dog can help you," she'd said. "I mean, don't get me wrong," the man continued, apparently interpreting my silence as permission. "I respect the military. My grandfather was in Korea. But you young people, you're also," he waved his hand vaguely, "fragile. Back then, soldiers just dealt with it. They didn't need therapy dogs and safe spaces." My jaw clenched. Ranger felt it and pressed harder against me, grounding me in the present, in this seat, in this moment. Not in Kandahar. Not in the medical tent where they'd piece Sergeant Morrison back together while I held what was left of his hand. Not in Al Udeid where I'd spent 72 hours straight coordinating medevac flights until my hands shook so badly I couldn't hold a pen. You just don't know what it was like, I said softly, still not looking at him. What was like? He sounded genuinely curious now, like this was just an interesting intellectual debate. Being in the military? My taxes pay for your service, sweetheart. I think I've earned the right to have an opinion about it. The flight attendant's voice crackled over the intercom, announcing our departure time. 1600 hours. 4 o'clock. I'd been awake since 0500, had driven 3 hours to the airport, had gone through security where the TSA agent saw Ranger's vest and thanked me for my service without meeting my eyes. It was always like that. Thank you for your service in one breath. You don't look disabled in the next. You military types are all the same, the man said, settling back into his seat as we accelerated down the runway. PTSD this, PTSD that. Maybe you just missed the attention. The words hit like a gut punch, sharp and sudden and precisely aimed. I'd heard variations before, from my father who'd served in Vietnam and thought I should just toughen up, from my ex-husband who'd left because he couldn't handle the nightmares, from strangers on the internet who saw my testimony before Congress and called me a crisis actor. But hearing it here, trapped in this aluminum tube at 30,000 feet with nowhere to go, made something crack in my chest. Ranger nudged my leg harder, his nose pressing insistent against my thigh. I was clenching my fists. My breathing had gone shallow. He was doing his job, pulling me back from the edge of a panic attack that would only prove this man right. I forced my hands open, pressed them flat against my thighs, counted backwards from 10 in my head, a technique I'd learned from Dr. Martinez during our sessions. 10, 9, 8. Ranger's tail thumped once against the floor. 7, 6, 5. The plane leveled out, the seatbelt sign still glowing above us. 4, 3, 2, 1. I'm not looking for attention, I said finally, my voice steady despite the earthquake happening inside my ribs. I'm just trying to get to my brother's wedding. The man snorted. Well, you're certainly getting it anyway. Everyone's staring at that dog like you're some kind of hero. I turned to look at him then, really look at him. He had kind eyes, which somehow made it worse. This wasn't a cruel man. He was probably a good father, a decent husband, someone who donated to charity and held doors open for strangers. He just didn't understand that you could look fine on the outside and be drowning on the inside. That some wounds didn't show up on x-rays. I don't want to be a hero, I said. I just want to be able to fly without having a panic attack. He opened his mouth to respond, then seemed to think better of it. Turned back to his phone. For a moment I thought maybe I'd gotten through to him, that he'd realize what he was doing. But then he muttered, just loud enough for me to hear, whatever helps you sleep at night. I closed my eyes and kept my hand on Ranger's head. Outside the window, clouds stretched endlessly in every direction, white and pristine and completely indifferent to the small cruelties happening inside this plane. Somewhere below us, people were living their normal lives, unaware that up here a man who'd never been to war was telling a veteran that her trauma wasn't real. Ranger sighed and settled his weight more firmly against my legs. Good boy. Always such a good boy. The humiliation didn't burn hot. It burned cold, spreading through my chest like ice water in my veins. Not for myself, I'd been through worse than words from strangers. But for every veteran sitting in a VA waiting room, every soldier still deployed who'd come home to this same dismissal. For Morrison, who didn't make it home at all. For Captain Chen, who'd eaten his service weapon 6 months after retirement because nobody believed him either. I'd spent 8 years in the Air Force. Joined at 22, fresh out of ROTC with my shiny new second lieutenant bars and enough idealism to fill a cargo plane. Worked my way up to captain by 30, earned a Bronze Star for coordinating that rescue operation in Kandahar when half our air support was grounded and we had troops pinned down in a valley. Got a Purple Heart for the IED that ended my career and left me with ringing in my ears that would never stop and nightmares that therapy could soften, but never quite cure. And this man thought I brought Ranger on planes for attention. The flight attendant came by with drinks. I ordered water. The man ordered coffee, black, and made small talk with her about the weather in San Diego. He had a nice smile when he used it. Probably made him successful in business, that smile. Made people want to trust him. When she moved on, he glanced at me again. Look, I didn't mean to offend you. I'm just saying, in my day, your day. I kept my voice level. When exactly was your day? Which branch did you serve in? He shifted uncomfortably. I didn't serve. Medical deferment. But my grandfather, right? Your grandfather. I nodded slowly. So you're an expert on military trauma based on what? Stories your grandfather told at Thanksgiving. His face reddened. I pay taxes. That gives me the right, it gives you the right to vote, I interrupted, still quiet, still controlled. It doesn't give you the right to tell me my trauma isn't real. We sat in silence after that. The plane hummed around us, carrying us toward California at 500 miles per hour. Ranger's breathing stayed even, his presence solid and warm and utterly reliable in a way that humans rarely were. I stared out the window and tried not to think about what would happen at the wedding. My brother Ethan had never understood the PTSD either. Thought I should just get over it like it was a bad breakup instead of a fundamental rewiring of my nervous system. He'd asked me not to bring Ranger, said it would be distracting during the ceremony. I'd told him gently but firmly that Ranger came with me or I didn't come at all. He'd backed down. But I knew there would be questions, comments, well-meaning relatives who'd want to pet Ranger or ask invasive questions about my service. There always were. The man beside me pulled out his laptop and started working on a spreadsheet. His coffee sat steaming in the cup holder between us, expensive airport coffee that probably tasted like burnt cardboard but cost $6 anyway. He typed with aggressive precision, his jaw still tight from our exchange. I closed my eyes and practiced my breathing. In for 4, hold for 4, out for 6. Ranger's heartbeat against my leg, steady as a metronome. The white noise of the engines, familiar now after 3 years of forcing myself onto planes despite every instinct screaming that enclosed spaces were dangerous, that crowds meant threats, that being trapped meant being vulnerable. You never do, I thought, looking at the man's profile. You never realize who's sitting next to you. What they've seen, what they carry, what it costs them just to be here. But maybe that was the point. Maybe invisibility was its own kind of survival. I must have dozed off, because I woke to Ranger's nose pressed firmly against my hand, his way of telling me my heart rate had spiked. For a moment I didn't know where I was. The cabin lights were dim, the sky outside turning that peculiar shade of blue-gray that meant late afternoon at altitude. Then I remembered. The plane. The man. San Diego. My brother's wedding was tomorrow at 1400 hours. 2 o'clock. I'd practiced saying it both ways now, military time and civilian time, trying to code switch smoothly enough that nobody would comment. Ethan had asked me not to be too military at the wedding, whatever that meant. Not to correct people when they got ranks wrong, not to mention deployment, not to be a reminder that war existed while everyone was trying to celebrate love. I understood what he meant, even if it hurt. Nobody wanted to think about IEDs and casualties during champagne toasts. But it meant I had to carefully edit myself, file down all the sharp edges that 8 years of service had left on me, pretend to be the sister I'd been before I joined up. The man in 22B was still working, his coffee cup empty now in the holder between us. He hadn't said anything else since our exchange, and I was grateful for that small mercy. Ranger stretched slightly, careful not to take up too much space, and yawned. Outside the window, clouds piled up like mountain ranges, gold-edged from the sun we couldn't quite see. I remembered flying back from my last deployment, looking out at a view almost exactly like this one, thinking about how strange it was that the sky looked the same everywhere. In Afghanistan, in Qatar, in the airspace over the Pacific, clouds were clouds, blue was blue. Only the ground changed. Ma'am? A flight attendant appeared beside us, a different one this time, younger, with her hair pulled back in a neat bun. She crouched slightly so she was at eye level with me. I noticed your service dog. Are you both comfortable? Do you need anything? We're fine, thank you, I said automatically. It was always my first response. I'm fine. Even when I wasn't, even when the walls were closing in and my hands were shaking and every sudden noise sent adrenaline flooding through my system. I'm fine was the shield between me and people's pity. She smiled, but it was different from the man's smile earlier. This one reached her eyes. I just wanted to let you know, the captain's a veteran too. Navy, flew helicopters before he transferred to commercial. He gets it. Something loosened in my chest. That's good to know. If you need anything during the flight, anything at all, you just press the call button. Okay. She squeezed my shoulder gently before moving on to check on other passengers. The man beside me had heard the exchange. I could tell by the way his typing had paused, his fingers hovering over the keyboard. He cleared his throat. I didn't know, he said quietly. I didn't answer. Didn't know what? That service dogs were real? That PTSD was legitimate? That the woman in 22C had actually served instead of being some entitled millennial looking for special treatment? My son, he continued, and now his voice was different, smaller somehow. He enlisted last year. Army. He's deploying to Kuwait next month. I turned to look at him. His face had changed, the smug certainty replaced by something rawer. Fear, maybe. The kind of fear that parents carried when their children went to war. How old is he? I asked. 22. Just graduated from basic. He closed his laptop slowly, like the spreadsheet didn't matter anymore. He wanted to be a medic. Said he wanted to help people. 22. The same age I'd been when I commissioned. Young enough to still believe in clear good guys and bad guys, old enough to legally sign your life over to the government. I remembered that feeling, the pride, the purpose, the absolute certainty that I was doing something important. Medics are good people, I said carefully. They save a lot of lives. Yeah. He rubbed his face with both hands. His mother's terrified. I keep telling her he'll be fine, that Kuwait's not like Iraq was, but he gestured vaguely. I don't actually know, do I? I've never been. My grandfather never talked about Korea except to say it was cold. So I don't know what to tell my son, or my wife, or myself. And there it was. The real reason for his comments earlier. Not cruelty, but fear looking for somewhere to land. He'd seen me with Ranger and thought, that could be my son someday. Broken, needing help, not the same person who left. It didn't excuse what he'd said, but it explained it. Tell him to listen to his NCOs, I said, echoing what my first commanding officer had told me on my first deployment. Tell him to take care of himself so he can take care of others. Tell him the job matters, but coming home matters more. The man nodded, his throat working. Is that what your commander told you? Lieutenant Colonel Harlow. Best CO I ever had. I smiled slightly, remembering her. She'd been 45 years old, tough as titanium, and had pulled me aside after our first contact to make sure I was okay. Really okay. Not just saying I am okay. She saved my life more than once, and I never even saw her fire a weapon. How? She taught me that leadership wasn't about being fearless. It was about being afraid and doing the job anyway. She taught me that asking for help wasn't weakness, it was wisdom. I paused. And she taught me that PTSD wasn't something to be ashamed of. It was just your brain trying to keep you alive in a situation where it thought you might die. The man was quiet for a long moment. Then, I'm sorry. For what I said earlier. Are you? I kept my voice neutral. Or are you just scared now that you realize your son might come home needing what I need? He flinched. But he didn't look away. Both, maybe? Does that count? I considered this. Ranger's head was heavy and warm against my leg, his breathing deep and even. 3 years ago, I wouldn't have been able to have this conversation. I would have shut down, gone nonverbal, maybe excused myself to hide in the bathroom until the panic passed. But Dr. Ortiz had paired me with Ranger for a reason. She'd seen something in me that I couldn't see in myself, the capacity to heal, even if I'd never be fully healed. It counts, I said finally. But you should know, whatever your son experiences over there, if he sees combat, if he doesn't, he's going to come back different. Everyone does. And the best thing you can do for him is believe him when he tells you what he needs. Even if what he needs is a dog like yours? Especially if what he needs is a dog like mine. The cabin lights came up slightly as the flight attendants began preparing for our descent. I could feel the pressure change in my ears, the subtle shift in the angle of the plane. We'd been in the air for 3 hours and 45 minutes. In another 20 minutes, we'd be on the ground in San Diego, and I'd have to navigate the airport and the rental car and the hotel and all the small wars that came with being out in the world. But I'd have Ranger. And that made it possible. The announcement chime sounded, clear and bright over the ambient noise of the cabin. Static crackled through the speakers, and then a man's voice came through, calm and professional. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is Captain Reeves speaking. We're beginning our initial descent into San Diego International Airport. We should be on the ground in approximately 20 minutes. Weather is clear, 72 degrees, and we're expecting a smooth landing." Standard stuff. I'd heard variations of this announcement on dozens of flights. I settled back in my seat, my hand automatically going to Ranger's head, preparing for the descent. That was usually the hardest part for me, the loss of altitude, the feeling of falling even though I knew intellectually we weren't falling, we were landing. But my nervous system didn't care about logic. The captain continued, "Before we begin our final approach, I'd like to take a moment to acknowledge a passenger on board today. Captain Amelia Stewart, United States Air Force, recipient of the Bronze Star and the Purple Heart. Ma'am, it's an honor to have you on this flight." Time stopped. Every head in the cabin turned toward me. I felt the man in 22B go rigid beside me, felt the weight of 100 pairs of eyes landing on my face. The flight attendant who'd asked about Ranger earlier was smiling at me from the front of the cabin, her hand over her heart. My own heart was hammering, but not with panic. With something else. Something I couldn't quite name. "Thank you for your service," the captain said, his voice warm even through the tinny speakers. "And to all our veterans and active duty military on board today, thank you. We'll see you on the ground in a few minutes." The announcement ended. For a moment, absolute silence filled the cabin. Then someone started clapping. Then someone else. Then the whole plane erupted in applause, and I sat frozen in 22C with tears I didn't remember allowing threatening to spill over. I never cried. Hadn't cried since the memorial service for my unit. Hadn't let myself cry because crying meant vulnerability, and vulnerability meant weakness, and weakness meant dying. But here I was, 32 years old and medically retired and sitting on a commercial flight, and I was crying. Ranger pressed against my leg, steady and sure and completely unconcerned with the attention. "Good boy. Such a good boy." The man in 22B was staring at me, his face completely white, his mouth slightly open. The coffee cup he'd been reaching for slipped from his fingers and hit the tray table with a dull thunk, brown liquid spilling across the white plastic and dripping onto his expensive slacks. He didn't seem to notice. I nodded toward the flight attendant who'd clearly told the captain about me, managed a small smile that probably looked more like a grimace. The applause faded as people turned back to preparing for landing, collecting trash, putting away laptops, checking that their seatbacks were upright and their tray tables were locked. But I could still feel the weight of what had just happened, heavy and complicated in my chest. The man beside me finally found his voice. "Captain Stewart." He stopped, started again. "I didn't know," I said softly, looking straight ahead, watching the flight attendants move through their practiced choreography. "You didn't." My voice wasn't cruel. It wasn't triumphant. It was just true. He hadn't known. Hadn't realized. Hadn't considered that the woman in 22C with the service dog might actually be someone who'd earned the right to have that dog, who'd paid for it in ways that had nothing to do with money. He stammered something else, an apology maybe, but I wasn't really listening anymore. I was focused on my breathing, on Ranger's solid presence, on the fact that in 15 minutes I'd be on the ground and this flight would be over and I'd never have to see this man again. The plane descended through layers of clouds, and I watched San Diego appear below us, all white buildings and blue ocean and palm trees that looked fake from this height. Somewhere down there, my brother was probably stressing about last-minute wedding details. unaware that his sister was up here having her identity broadcast to a plane full of strangers. I should have been angry. Or embarrassed. Or something. Instead, I just felt tired. The tired that no amount of sleep could fix, the kind that lived in your bones and made everything feel like wading through deep water. This was supposed to be a victory, wasn't it? The look on that man's face when he realized he'd been mocking an actual veteran, an actual wounded soldier. This was the revenge fantasy that people wrote stories about, the moment when the bully gets their comeuppance. But it didn't feel like victory. It felt like exhaustion. Because the truth was, this man, Mr. Businessman in his expensive suit with his son deploying to Kuwait, he was just one person. Tomorrow there'd be another person at the grocery store asking invasive questions about Ranger. Next week there'd be someone at a restaurant telling me I didn't look disabled. Next month there'd be a stranger on the internet insisting that PTSD was overdiagnosed and modern soldiers were soft. The captain's announcement hadn't changed that. It had just changed this one moment, on this one flight, with this one man. The wheels touched down with a gentle bump, and I felt my whole body relax in a way it hadn't since we'd taken off. Ground. Solid ground. We taxied toward the gate, the seatbelt sign still glowing, and I concentrated on breathing evenly and not letting the tears that had threatened earlier actually fall. Captain Stewart. The man's voice was barely above a whisper. I'm sorry. Truly. He stopped, then continued more firmly. There's no excuse for what I said. I was projecting my own fear onto you, and that wasn't fair. I turned to look at him then. Really look at him. He had tears in his eyes too, I noticed. His coffee-stained slacks, his clenched jaw, his hands gripping the armrests like he was the one who needed grounding. Your son, I said quietly, is going to need people who believe him when he comes home. Whatever he says, whatever he needs, believe him. Don't make him prove his pain to you. He nodded, unable to speak. The plane pulled up to the gate. The seatbelt sign dinged off. All around us, passengers stood and began collecting their belongings, the usual choreographed chaos of deplaning. But the man and I sat still, separated by the middle seat, connected by something neither of us had expected. Callan Briggs, he said finally, offering his hand across the empty seat. I looked at his hand for a long moment, then took it. His grip was firm but not aggressive, desperate but not demanding. Amelia, I said. Just my name, no rank. No title. Just the person I was trying to remember how to be. We let go. He grabbed his bag from the overhead bin, then paused. Will you? He stopped, started again. Would you be willing to talk to my son? Before he deploys? Maybe give him some advice from someone who's actually been there. I thought about this. About what it would mean to talk to a 22-year-old kid preparing to see things no 22-year-old should have to see. About whether I had anything useful to offer him, or if I'd just be another voice telling him things he wouldn't understand until it was too late. But I thought about Lieutenant Colonel Harlow and Dr. Ortiz, and the flight attendant who'd seen Ranger and thought to mention me to the captain. I thought about all the people who'd helped me when I couldn't help myself, who'd believed me when I couldn't believe myself. Give me your number, I said. I'll call you when I get back from the wedding. He pulled out his phone with shaking hands, and we exchanged contact information while the line of passengers moved slowly past us. The flight attendant who'd spoken to me earlier stopped by my seat. Thank you, she said simply. My husband's active duty. I wanted the captain to know you were here. Lydia Chin, I read from her name tag. Thank you for that. You didn't have to. Yes, she said firmly, I did. And then she moved on, and it was time for me to stand, to gather my things, to step back out into the world with Ranger at my side. The terminal was chaos, families reuniting, business travelers speedwalking to their connections, tourists with their sunburns and their roller bags. I wove through the crowd with practiced efficiency, Ranger clearing a path simply by existing. People saw the vest and moved aside without being asked. It was the one advantage of having him, this invisible bubble that kept the world at a manageable distance. At baggage claim, I waited for my single suitcase and thought about what I'd say to Ethan when I saw him. Whether I'd tell him about the flight, about the man, about the captain's announcement. Probably not. He wouldn't understand why it mattered, and I didn't have the energy to explain. Captain Stewart. I turned. Callan Briggs stood a few feet away, his own bag already retrieved, his coffee-stained slacks making him look rumpled and human instead of polished and perfect. "I was out of line," he said again, like he needed to keep saying it until I absolved him. "My son, Daniel, he ships out in 4 weeks. He laughed, but it wasn't a happy sound. "I'm terrified. I don't know how to let him go." I studied him for a long moment. Ranger leaned against my leg, patient, waiting for whatever came next. "Then tell him that," I said. "Tell him you're scared. Tell him you love him. Tell him to listen to his NCOs and to come home alive. That's all any of us want to hear from the people we leave behind." "What else?" His voice was urgent now, desperate. "What else should I tell him?" The carousel started moving, luggage appearing one bag at a time. I saw my black suitcase 3 bags away and prepared to grab it. "Tell him that whatever happens over there, whatever he sees or does or survives, it doesn't make him broken. It makes him human. And tell him that asking for help isn't giving up. It's how you keep going." My bag came around. I grabbed it with one hand, kept Ranger's leash in the other. Callan was still standing there, looking at me like I had answers I didn't actually have. "And tell him," I added softly, "that there are people like me on the other side. People who made it through and kept living. Tell him it's possible." "Is it?" he asked. "Possible, I mean. To really make it through." I looked down at Ranger, who was watching me with those steady brown eyes that never judged, never doubted, never asked me to be anything other than what I was. "I'm here," I said. "That has to count for something." Callan nodded slowly. Then, impulsively, he stepped forward and hugged me, brief, awkward, but genuine. I stood stiff for a moment, not used to being touched by strangers, but then I let myself accept it. This man's fear, his apology, his desperate love for a son about to walk into danger. When he stepped back, he was crying openly. "Thank you. For your service. For talking to me. For not," he gestured helplessly. "For not telling me to go to hell, which I deserved." "You have a son deploying," I said simply. "That's its own kind of hell." He laughed again, watery but real. "Yeah, it really is." We stood there for one more moment, 2 strangers who'd been united and divided by a 3-hour flight and 45 seconds of recognition over an intercom. Then he nodded one final time and walked away, disappearing into the crowd of travelers. I watched him go, then turned toward the exit, toward the California sunshine waiting beyond the terminal doors, toward my brother's wedding and all the careful small talk I'd have to navigate tomorrow. But tonight, I'd made it. I'd gotten on a plane, survived a confrontation, accepted a public acknowledgement of my service, and managed to stand here without falling apart. Tonight, that was enough. Ranger and I walked toward the rental car counters, his tags jingling softly with each step, his presence steady and sure beside me. The terminal was bright with afternoon light, and outside I could see palm trees swaying in a breeze I couldn't yet feel. For more days until I flew home. For more days of being the sister Ethan wanted me to be, of answering questions about my service, of smiling through awkward thank yous from people who meant well but didn't understand. But I'd survived worse. And I had Ranger. And somewhere in San Diego, a man named Callan Briggs was probably calling his wife to tell her about the veteran he'd met on the plane, the woman with the service dog he'd mocked before he knew better. Maybe it would make him kinder. Maybe it wouldn't. Either way, it wasn't my responsibility to change him. I'd done my job, served my country, survived my tours, kept living despite everything that made living hard. Everything else was just bonus rounds. The rental car was a silver Toyota Camry that smelled like industrial cleaning solution and someone else's air freshener. I adjusted the seat, the mirrors, the air conditioning, and gave Ranger a chance to settle in the back seat before starting the engine. He'd been trained for cars before planes, shorter distances, easier environments. But he was a pro at both now, 3 years into our partnership. The GPS estimated 25 minutes to my hotel in La Jolla. I pulled out of the rental lot and merged onto Harbor Drive, watching the bay stretch out blue and endless to my left. San Diego was beautiful in that aggressively perfect way that California cities were, all sunshine and flower beds and people who'd never seen snow jogging past in expensive athletic wear. My phone buzzed in the cup holder. Text from Ethan. Landed yet? Driving to hotel now, I typed back at a red light. See you tomorrow at rehearsal dinner. Can't wait. Mom's here already. She's excited to see you. I didn't respond to that. Mom and I had a complicated relationship that boiled down to, she loved the daughter she'd raised, and that daughter had died somewhere over the Hindu Kush. The woman who'd come back might have the same face, but she wasn't the same person. Mom kept waiting for me to return to who I was before, and I kept failing to be that person. The hotel was nice, one of those places with a fountain in the lobby and staff who smiled with all their teeth. I checked in, declined help with my single bag, and took the elevator to the 3rd floor. Room 312. The key card worked on the second try. I let Ranger explore the room first, watching him sniff the corners and check under the bed with serious efficiency. When he seemed satisfied that no threats were lurking behind the complimentary coffee maker, I set my bag on the luggage rack and sat on the edge of the bed. 3:45 p.m. The rehearsal dinner was tomorrow at 18:30 hours, 6:30. Wedding at 1400 on Saturday, reception until 2200. Then a flight home Sunday morning at 0900, assuming I could make it through the weekend without any major incidents. I pulled out my phone and scrolled through the messages I'd been ignoring. One from Dr. Martinez reminding me about our phone session next week. Two from Dad, both just saying "love you, Melly," because he didn't know what else to say to me anymore. One from Jessica, my former roommate from officer training school, asking if I'd be at the Air Force Association reunion next month. I wouldn't be. I'd tried going last year and spent the whole night feeling like a ghost haunting my own life, watching people I used to know talk about their current assignments while I explained for the 100th time that I'd been medically retired. The pity in their eyes was worse than Callan Briggs's mockery. Ranger jumped onto the bed. Technically, he wasn't supposed to, but I'd never enforced that rule, and rested his head on my lap. I scratched behind his ears and tried to decide if I had the energy to leave the room for dinner or if I should just order room service and hide until tomorrow. My phone rang. Unknown number with a San Diego area code. Hello, Captain Stewart? This is Captain Ben Reeves. I was your pilot this afternoon. I sat up straighter, an automatic response to hearing rank, even though we were both in civilian life now. Yes, sir. Hello. Please, it's just Ben. I'm off duty. He had a warm voice, the kind that probably made nervous flyers feel safe. I wanted to call and apologize if the announcement made you uncomfortable. My flight attendant, Lydia, mentioned your service dog, and I thought you deserved recognition. But I realize now I should have asked first. It's fine, I said automatically. Then, more honestly, it was unexpected. But it was fine. I'm Navy, flew Seahawks for 12 years before I got out and went commercial. I know how it is, traveling with visible markers of service. People either thank you or judge you, no in between. That's accurate. I watched Ranger's chest rise and fall, his breathing already syncing with mine like it always did. Do you have a service dog? No, but my brother does. Marines, 2 tours in Helmand. He's got a German shepherd named Sarge who won't let him sleep without checking the whole apartment first. Drives his wife crazy, but it keeps him functional. I smiled despite myself. Ranger checks under the bed. Every hotel room, every time. Won't settle until he's cleared all the corners. They're good dogs, Ben said quietly. Better than most people. Yeah, they really are. There was a pause, comfortable rather than awkward. I could hear ambient airport noise in the background, announcements, the beep of jetway equipment, the endless hum of a place that never stopped moving. The reason I'm calling, Ben said finally, besides apologizing for the announcement, is to tell you what happened after you deplaned. The man who was sitting next to you, 22B? He came up to the cockpit. My stomach tightened. Oh. He was crying. Asked me to apologize to you on his behalf, said he'd been unconscionably rude during the flight and that he felt like garbage about it. He mentioned his son's deploying soon. I told him I couldn't give out passenger information, but I wanted you to know he seemed genuinely remorseful. I thought about Callan at baggage claim, his coffee-stained pants and his desperate questions about what to tell Daniel. We talked afterward. At the airport. He apologized in person. Good. That's good. Ben sounded relieved. I fly a lot of military, active, and retired. I see how people treat them, especially the ones with visible injuries or service animals. It's why I try to acknowledge them when I can. Sometimes it helps. Sometimes it just makes things more complicated. It helped today, I said, surprising myself by meaning it. It was uncomfortable, but it helped. I'm glad. Listen, I don't know if you're busy this weekend, but there's a veterans coffee meetup on Sunday mornings at a place in La Jolla. Nothing formal, just people who've served. I go when I'm not flying. You'd be welcome if you wanted to come. I looked at Ranger, who'd started snoring softly, his paws twitching in some dream I'd never fully understand. I have my brother's wedding on Saturday. Flying out Sunday morning. Another time, maybe. I'm based here, so I'm around. He paused. And Captain Stewart? Thank you for your service. I know everyone says it, but I mean it. Bronze Star and Purple Heart, that's real sacrifice. So it's 12 years flying rescue, I said quietly. Thank you for yours. We said goodbye, and I set the phone down, feeling something in my chest that might have been hope or might have been heartburn from airplane peanuts. It was hard to tell sometimes, the difference between positive emotions and just the absence of negative ones. I ordered room service, a burger I wouldn't finish and fries Ranger would get half of, even though he wasn't supposed to have people food. Then I took a long shower, letting the water run hot enough to turn the bathroom into a steam room, and tried not to think about tomorrow. The rehearsal dinner would be small, just immediate family and the wedding party. I'd know everyone there, which should have been comforting but wasn't. These were people who'd known me before, who remembered the Amelia who laughed easily and didn't startle at sudden noises and could handle crowded restaurants without needing a service dog pressed against her leg. I'd tried to explain it once to Ethan, how coming home felt like being a stranger in my own life. He'd said, "But you're still you, Mel. You're still my sister." And I hadn't known how to tell him that being his sister was a role I was playing now, not an identity I inhabited. The real me, whoever that was, existed in the space between flashbacks and therapy appointments, between the person I used to be and whoever I was becoming. My phone buzzed again. Mom, this time. Ethan says you're here. Can't wait to see you tomorrow, sweetie. I'm making your favorite dessert for the rehearsal dinner, lemon bars. I stared at the message for a long moment. Lemon bars had been my favorite when I was 16. I wasn't sure what my favorite was now. I wasn't sure I had one. Thanks, Mom, I typed back. Looking forward to it. Lies we told to keep the peace. The burger arrived and I ate half of it mechanically, watching some home renovation show on mute while Ranger crunched his kibble from the bowl I'd packed. Normal. This was normal. Just a woman in a hotel room with her dog, preparing for her brother's wedding like thousands of other women across the country tonight. Except those other women probably weren't taking 0.5 milligrams of clonazepam to keep their anxiety manageable. Probably weren't setting 3 separate alarms because their sleep schedule was still wrecked 6 years after their last deployment. Probably weren't checking the locks on the door twice, then a third time, then once more to be absolutely certain. I pulled out my laptop and tried to work on the freelance editing project I'd taken on, a technical manual for aviation systems that needed proofreading. The work was fine, easy even, and it could be done entirely from home with no required human interaction. Perfect for someone whose resume included coordinated multi-theater air operations during active combat, but whose current skill set was can sometimes leave the house without having a panic attack. I made it through 10 pages before my concentration fractured. The words started swimming, and I realized I'd read the same paragraph about hydraulic pressure systems 4 times without absorbing any of it. I closed the laptop and lay back on the bed, staring at the ceiling. Ranger repositioned himself so his body was pressed along my side, warm and solid and real. This was what Dr. Ortiz had meant when she'd said the dog would give me something to anchor to. Not distraction, not therapy in the traditional sense, but just pure presence. Ranger didn't care about my Bronze Star or my Purple Heart or the fact that I'd failed to save 3 members of my unit during that IED strike. He cared that I fed him and walked him and scratched the spot on his back he couldn't reach himself. It was the most uncomplicated relationship I had. Tomorrow's going to be hard, buddy, I told him quietly. Lots of people. Lots of questions. Lots of pretending to be okay. His tail thumped once against the comforter. Agreement, or maybe just acknowledgement that I'd spoken. With Ranger, it was hard to tell sometimes where his training ended and his actual personality began. But it didn't matter. What mattered was that he'd be there, and that would make it possible. I set my alarms, 0600, 0615, 0630, and turned off the lights. The room was dark except for the thin line of light under the bathroom door, which I always left on in unfamiliar places. Another concession to survival, like checking locks and sleeping with my phone within reach and never, ever sitting with my back to a door. Sleep came in fits and starts, the way it always did. I dreamed about the plane, except in the dream Callan Briggs had a gun, and the cabin was full of smoke and Ranger was trying to pull me toward the emergency exit, but I couldn't move, couldn't breathe, couldn't. I woke at 0315 with my heart hammering and Ranger's nose pressed against my face, his weight half on top of me in the deep pressure therapy he'd been trained to provide during panic attacks. I focused on his breathing, on the solid warmth of him, on the fact that I was in La Jolla, California, in a hotel room, safe. "Good boy," I whispered when my breathing steadied. "Such a good boy." He licked my face once, then settled back down beside me, staying close enough that I could feel his heartbeat against my arm. I didn't try to go back to sleep. Just lay there in the dark, counting his breaths and mine, waiting for morning. By the time my first alarm went off at 0600, I'd already been awake for 2 hours. I felt it in my bones, that particular exhaustion that came from a night spent fighting your own nervous system. But I got up anyway, because that's what you did. You got up. You showered. You put on the dress you'd brought for the rehearsal dinner and the wedding, navy blue, conservative, the kind of thing that wouldn't draw attention or raise questions. I took my medication with a glass of water from the bathroom sink and stared at my reflection. 32 years old. I looked older, everyone said so. The laugh lines I'd had at 25 had deepened into something more permanent, and there were shadows under my eyes that no amount of concealer fully covered. But I could pass for normal mostly, as long as nobody looked too close. Ranger needed a walk before we left for the day, so I took him down to the beach access point the hotel advertised in its brochure. The morning was cool and gray, the marine layers still thick over the ocean. A few joggers passed us and one older man stopped to ask if he could pet Ranger. "He's working," I said politely, gesturing to the vest. "Sorry." "Oh, of course. Thank you for your service." He nodded and jogged on, and I stood there on the sand wondering how he'd known I'd served. Maybe the vest was enough of a tell. Maybe I just looked like a veteran now, whatever that meant. We walked for 20 minutes, long enough for Ranger to do his business and for me to watch the waves roll in with their eternal, indifferent rhythm. The ocean didn't care about PTSD or bronze stars or whether I could make it through my brother's wedding without embarrassing myself. The ocean just kept moving, pulling back and pushing forward, the same way it had for millions of years before I existed and would for millions of years after. There was something comforting about that. About being insignificant in the face of something that vast. Back at the hotel, I fed Ranger and checked my phone. Message from Ethan. "Mom wants us all there by 6 p.m. to take family photos before dinner." That okay? 1800 hours. I had the whole day to kill before then. I could work on the editing project, or watch TV, or just lie in bed and try to conserve energy for the social performance ahead. The third option was most appealing, but Dr. Martinez's voice echoed in my head. "Avoidance isn't coping, Amelia. You have to engage with life, even when it's hard." Fine. I'd engage. I spent the morning working on the technical manual, actually making decent progress this time. Ranger dozed in a patch of sunlight by the window, occasionally opening one eye to check on me before falling back asleep. Around noon, I ordered a salad from room service and ate it while watching the news, which was full of the usual chaos, political scandals, natural disasters, celebrity nonsense. The world kept spinning, problems kept piling up, and none of it had anything to do with me anymore. That was retirement, I was learning. Becoming irrelevant to the large-scale problems you used to help solve. In Kandahar, I'd coordinated air support that saved lives. Literally saved them, troops who would have died without the rescue operations I'd helped plan. Now I proofread technical manuals and tried not to have panic attacks in grocery stores. The loss of purpose was almost worse than the PTSD. At 1700 hours, I started getting ready, giving myself plenty of time to manage my anxiety about being late. Punctuality had been drilled into me during officer training. Early is on time is late, and I'd never been able to shake it even after separation. I put on the navy dress, minimal makeup, small earrings. Hair down because it made me look softer, less military. Ethan's request, technically, though he'd phrased it as a suggestion. Ranger got a fresh water bowl and a reminder that he was the goodest boy. Then we headed down to the rental car, and I programmed the GPS for the restaurant where the rehearsal dinner was being held. The drive took 15 minutes through La Jolla's winding streets, past million-dollar houses and boutiques that sold $300 candles. This was my brother's world now. He was a software engineer at a startup that had recently gone public, and his fiancée Rachel came from money. Old money, the kind that whispered rather than shouted. I'd met Rachel twice. She was nice in that polished way that people who'd never struggled were nice, genuine, but unable to fully comprehend hardship. She'd thanked me for my service both times we'd met, then immediately changed the subject like my military career was something slightly embarrassing, like having worked at McDonald's in high school. The restaurant was right on the water, one of those places with floor-to-ceiling windows and a hostess who looked like she'd stepped out of a fashion magazine. I gave my name, and she smiled with professionally whitened teeth. Oh yes, the Stewart party. They're already on the terrace. Right this way. I followed her through the main dining room, aware of eyes tracking Ranger as we walked. A few people smiled. One woman whispered something to her companion. I kept my face neutral and my pace steady, the way I'd learned to move through crowds, purposeful but not aggressive, present but not confrontational. The terrace was beautiful in that effortless California way, all string lights and ocean breeze, and the sound of waves in the background. My family was gathered around a large table, Mom and Dad, Ethan and Rachel, Rachel's parents who I'd never met, and a handful of other people I assumed were wedding party members. Ethan saw me first. His face lit up genuine joy, the kind that made me remember why I'd agreed to come despite everything. He crossed the terrace in quick strides and pulled me into a hug. Mel, you made it. Of course I made it. I said I would. I hugged him back, careful not to let Ranger's leash get tangled. He pulled back and looked at me, really looked, and I saw the moment his smile faltered slightly. The moment he noticed the shadows under my eyes, the tension I was carrying in my shoulders, all the small tells that I was holding myself together with willpower and medication. You look tired, he said quietly. It was a long flight. Not a lie, technically. Where do you want us? He led me to the table where Mom immediately stood up and rushed over, her eyes already wet with tears. Amelia. Oh, sweetheart, it's so good to see you. She hugged me tight, and I let her, even though physical affection from family was somehow harder than hugs from strangers like Callan Briggs. Strangers didn't have expectations. Family did. Hi, Mom. You look great. Also not a lie. She'd clearly had her hair done for the wedding, and she was wearing a dress that probably cost more than my monthly disability check. And this is Ranger. Mom crouched down, her hand already reaching out. Mom, don't, but she'd already touched him, and Ranger, bless him, stayed perfectly still in his working posture, tolerating the attention without engaging. He's working, I said, trying to keep my voice gentle. He can't be petted when he's in his vest. Oh, of course. Mom stood up, looking embarrassed. I forgot. I'm sorry. It's okay. It wasn't really, but we were in public and I wasn't going to make a scene at my brother's rehearsal dinner over a dog petting violation. Where should I sit? Dad appeared then, looking uncomfortable in a button-down shirt and slacks. He was a mechanic, had worked with his hands his whole life, and dress clothes always made him look like he was wearing a costume. He hugged me briefly, he'd never been demonstrative, and muttered, "Good to see you, Melly." "You too, Dad." The introductions began. Rachel's parents, Robert and Catherine, who smiled politely and thanked me for my service, with the same slightly uncomfortable tone that people used when they didn't know what else to say. The bridesmaids, whose names I immediately forgot. The groomsmen, including Ethan's best friend Marcus from college, who'd always been kind to me. The wedding planner, who wasn't eating with us, but was there to coordinate the schedule. I shook hands, smiled, made appropriate small talk, and tried to ignore the weight of all their attention on Ranger. He was the elephant in the room, or rather the dog on the terrace, and everyone was carefully not mentioning him while also clearly wondering about him. Finally, we sat down to eat. I'd been placed between Mom and one of the bridesmaids, a position that felt strategic, surrounded by women who would presumably be good at making conversation. Ranger settled under the table, his head resting on my foot, grounding me. The waiters brought wine. I declined. Alcohol and clonazepam didn't mix, and asked for water instead. Mom noticed. "Are you sure, sweetie? It's a celebration." "I'm sure. I don't really drink anymore." Her face did something complicated, understanding and worry and disappointment all at once. But she didn't push, just patted my hand and turned to talk to Rachel's mother about flowers or centerpieces or some other wedding detail. The bridesmaid next to me, Emma, I remembered after she reintroduced herself, tried gamely to start a conversation. "So you're Ethan's sister. He talks about you all the time. You're in the Air Force." "Was. I'm retired now." "Oh. You're so young to be retired. That must be nice, not having to work." I took a sip of water and tried to find a response that wouldn't sound bitter. "It's an adjustment." "I bet. So, what do you do now?" "Freelance editing, mostly. Technical documents." "That sounds interesting." Her tone suggested it sounded anything but. "And is Ranger your pet? Or is he a therapy dog?" "Service dog. He's trained to help with PTSD." The words hung in the air between us. Emma's smile didn't fade, but it changed, became more careful. "Oh, that's really good that you have him. I've heard service dogs are amazing." "They are." The conversation died there. Emma turned to talk to the bridesmaid on her other side, and I was left with my water glass and my racing thoughts and Ranger's steady presence against my leg. This was going to be a long night. Dinner was served in courses, some kind of fancy salad, then fish that was probably delicious, but tasted like cardboard in my mouth, then dessert that included Mom's lemon bars. Everyone complimented them. I ate one and remembered being 16, before the Air Force, before everything, when lemon bars were actually my favorite. They still tasted good. That was something. After dinner came the toasts. Dad stood up first, uncomfortable with public speaking, but pushing through it out of love for Ethan. He talked about watching his son grow up, about being proud of the man he'd become, about knowing Rachel would make him happy. It was sweet and awkward and genuine. Then Rachel's father stood up, smooth and polished and clearly comfortable with speeches. He talked about family, about tradition, about the joining of two lives. He mentioned how Rachel had always known what she wanted, and how glad he was that she'd found Ethan. Then it was the best man's turn, Marcus, who told embarrassing college stories that made everyone laugh. Then the maid of honor, Rachel's sister, who cried through her whole speech about sisterhood and love. And then Ethan stood up and looked directly at me. "I want to thank my sister for being here," he said, his voice catching slightly. "Amelia couldn't always make it to family events over the years because of her service, and having her here now means everything to me. So, to Mel, thank you for coming home." Everyone turned to look at me, raised their glasses, smiled with varying degrees of understanding. I raised my water glass and nodded, my throat too tight to speak. Coming home, I thought. If only it were that simple. The toasts ended and people began mingling, the formal part of the evening giving way to casual conversation. I stayed in my seat, one hand on Ranger's head, watching my family interact with Rachel's family like two tribes negotiating a treaty. Mom was charming Rachel's mother, Dad was talking to Rachel's father about something that involved hand gestures, and Ethan and Rachel were wrapped up in each other like the rest of us didn't exist. That's what being in love looked like, I remembered distantly. That total absorption in another person. I'd felt it once, with Brian, before I'd deployed to Kandahar the second time. He'd asked me to reconsider, to see if I could get a stateside assignment instead. I'd told him the mission mattered more than my comfort. He'd said he understood. He hadn't. By the time I got back, he was engaged to someone else. Someone whose nightmares weren't loud enough to wake the neighbors. Amelia? Mom appeared at my side, her face soft with wine and maternal concern. Are you doing okay, honey? You seem quiet. I'm fine. Just tired from traveling. You could have brought someone, you know. We put and guessed on your invitation. I know. It's just me and Ranger. She looked at the dog with an expression I couldn't quite read. He's very well behaved. I barely notice he's there. That's the point. But don't you ever feel, I don't know, limited? Always having to bring him places, having to explain to people. I counted to 5 in my head before answering. He's not a limitation, Mom. He's the reason I can be here at all. Oh, of course. I didn't mean, she stopped, started again. I just want you to be happy, sweetheart. To have a normal life. This is my normal life. She looked like she wanted to say more, but Dad called her over to settle some debate about the wine list, and she squeezed my shoulder before walking away. The touch was meant to be comforting. It just made me feel more alone. I stood up, needing air that wasn't full of my family's careful concern and Rachel's family's polite curiosity. Come on, Ranger. We made our way to the edge of the terrace, where the noise was less overwhelming. The sun had set while we ate, and now the ocean was just darkness and the sound of waves. String lights overhead made everything look magical, like we were all characters in some perfect story where weddings solved everything and love conquered all. Your dog is beautiful. I turned. Rachel's sister, the maid of honor, was standing a few feet away, holding a glass of wine. Sarah, I remembered. She was 25, worked in marketing or PR or something adjacent to social media. Thank you. His name's Ranger. Rachel mentioned you served in Afghanistan. That must have been intense. It was. She waited for me to elaborate. When I didn't, she sipped her wine and tried again. What was it like? Being in the Air Force? Necessary. Difficult. Important. I kept my answer short, hoping she'd take the hint. She didn't. Did you fly planes? Or, wait, that's probably a stupid question. What did you actually do? Intelligence officer. Coordinated operations. Oh, like spies and stuff? No. More like logistics and information analysis. That sounds cool. Another sip of wine. So, why did you stop? And there it was, the question everyone wanted to ask, but usually had the grace to avoid. Why did you stop? What happened to you? Why aren't you still serving if it was so important? Medical retirement, I said, my voice flat. Got injured. Oh my God, that's awful. What kind of injury? I stared at her, this woman who thought it was appropriate to ask a stranger about their trauma at a rehearsal dinner. The kind I don't discuss with people I just met. Her face flushed. Right. Sorry. I was curious. My boyfriend might join the military, and I wanted to understand, tell him to think carefully about it, I said. And if he goes, make sure he takes care of himself. Physically and mentally. Is that what you did wrong? The question was out before she seemed to realize how it sounded. Her eyes widened. I didn't mean, I know what you meant. I took a breath, reminded myself that she was young and drunk and stupid, not malicious. I did everything right. Sometimes that's not enough. I walked away before she could respond, before I said something I'd regret, before the anger building in my chest turned into something uglier. Ranger pressed against my leg, sensing the spike in my heart rate, doing his job even though every person at this party was making his job harder. Marcus found me near the entrance, away from the main crowd. Hey Mel, you doing okay? I liked Marcus. He'd visited me at Walter Reed after I'd been stateside, hadn't asked invasive questions, just sat with me and talked about normal things like movies and music. He got it somehow, despite never having served. Your definition of okay might be different from mine. He smiled. Fair. Want to get some air? Actual air, not terrace air. Please. We walked down to the beach access, Ranger between us, and stood where the manicured restaurant grounds gave way to natural sand. The noise from the party faded into something manageable, just murmuring voices and the endless ocean. Rachel's sister is an idiot, Marcus said after a moment. I saw that interaction. She doesn't have a filter when she drinks. It's fine. It's not, but I appreciate you not making a scene. He picked up a piece of driftwood and threw it into the darkness. Ethan's really glad you came. I promised I would. Yeah, but you could have bailed. I know this isn't easy for you. I glanced at him, trying to figure out how much Ethan had told him. Marcus caught my look and shook his head. He didn't tell me anything specific. Just that you've been through hell and you're working through it. And that having you here means everything to him. He said that in his toast. Yeah, well, he meant it. Marcus shoved his hands in his pockets. My uncle has PTSD. Vietnam. He didn't get a service dog or therapy or anything because back then that wasn't really done. Just drank himself to death instead. So when I see you here, doing the work, showing up even when it's hard, that's heroic, Mel. That's actually heroic. My throat tightened. I'm just surviving. That's what heroism looks like most of the time. Not the metal stuff, the other stuff. The showing up day after day stuff. We stood in silence for a while, watching darkness where the ocean was. Ranger sat between us, calm and patient, his presence making the night feel less overwhelming. I should get back, I said finally. Before someone sends a search party. Yeah, but Mel? If you need to leave early or step out or whatever, just do it. Don't torture yourself for Ethan's sake. He'd rather you take care of yourself. Would he? Marcus looked at me seriously. Yes, he would. He's just bad at saying it. We walked back to the terrace where the party was still going strong. Mom was laughing at something Dad said. Ethan and Rachel were dancing to music I couldn't hear, and Rachel's family was taking photos with the ocean in the background. Normal people doing normal things at a normal celebration. I stayed for another hour, making conversation when required, smiling when appropriate, and counting down the minutes until I could politely leave. When the party started winding down around 2200 hours, I found Ethan to say goodnight. You're leaving already? Long day. Need to get Ranger settled. He hugged me tight. Thank you for being here, Mel. Really. It means everything. I'll see you tomorrow at the wedding. Yeah, tomorrow. He held me at arm's length, studying my face. You sure you're okay? I'm perfect, I lied. Get some sleep. You're getting married tomorrow. He laughed, and I walked away before the moment could get heavier, before he could ask more questions I didn't want to answer. The drive back to the hotel was quiet, just me and Ranger and the dark roads of La Jolla. I kept the radio off, letting the silence settle around me like a blanket. When we got back to the room, I fed Ranger and took my night medication and lay in bed staring at the ceiling. One day down. One to go. I could do this. I had to do this. Ranger jumped up on the bed and pressed against my side, his warmth solid and real and uncomplicated. I buried my fingers in his fur and tried to believe that showing up was enough, that surviving was enough, that I didn't need to be the Amelia everyone remembered as long as I could be the Amelia I was becoming. Outside, the ocean kept moving. Inside, I kept breathing. And tomorrow, I'd put on my dress and go to my brother's wedding and smile for photos and pretend that coming home was just that simple. But tonight, in this hotel room with just me and my dog and my medication, I could admit the truth. I was still at war. Just with different enemies now. And every day I showed up was another small battle won. Even if nobody else could see it. Thanks for writing this one out with me. If this hit home, like, subscribe, and share it with someone who needs to hear it. Your turn. Have you ever been judged for an invisible struggle? If you've flown with a service animal or sat near one, how did people react? Would a public apology change anything for you, or is quiet accountability enough? What advice would you give a parent with a son or daughter about to deploy? Where are you tuning in from? Drop your story in the comments. Let's make this a place where respect and understanding show up first.